Welcome back to How to Fix Democracy, the show about the future of American democracy. We're focusing on that in our fourth series this year. A couple of weeks ago, we talked to Dana Milbank, the author of The Destructionists and very popular, controversial columnist at the Washington Post. And part of our conversation for How to Fix Democracy focused on the role of the religious right, of the evangelical right in the new Republican Party, which he believes is destructionist. So who better to talk to about the impact of the evangelical right, of religious nationalism in America than my guest today, Katherine Stewart. She's the author of The Power Worshippers, and she's perhaps the world's leading authority on the role of religious fundamentalism in America and the future of American democracy. Katherine, welcome to How to Fix Democracy.
Thanks so much. It's good to be here.
Katherine, how important is the religious right within the contemporary Republican Party in America today?
It's really critical. I think that we can measure the impact of the movement on our politics by looking at its impact on our politics. This is a movement that has basically taken over the Republican Party. For many years, the Republican Party thought they could make use of this movement because it delivered a very reliable slice of votes to the Republican Party. But over the last decades, the movement has invested in a dense organizational infrastructure that turnouts ever larger numbers of votes in support of the candidates that they favor, which are very far right, very reactionary in terms of domestic policy, but also economic policy, foreign policy. And at this point, there are very few Republicans who can deviate from what the movement demands of them.
Katherine, I'm guessing your politics and my politics are relatively similar. I'm a great fan of the religious right, but would it be fair to say that they're against democracy itself? Can't one be on the right, be religious, believe in God, believe in the core truths of the Christian faith and still be a Democrat? A small d Democrat?
Listen, you can be a conservative and you can be a Christian and even a conservative Christian and not be a Christian nationalist and not support authoritarian politics. But unfortunately, this movement has become so radical, I think that we can't really consider it conservative anymore. It rejects the principles of equality and pluralism that represent the best of the American promise. It rejects elections, the consequences of elections that it doesn't like. It rejects the rule of law when the rule of law tries to say, go after a president who has, it's unbelievable, stolen hundreds of our most sensitive and secure documents that impact our national security. Of an ex-president stolen documents that impact our national security. I mean, this is so far outside the bounds of what is considered acceptable or patriotic. This is a movement that has really, it's radical to the core, it's anti-democratic all the way down.
Katherine, we had Peter Wehner, one of America's leading conservatives on the show a few months ago. He's a deep Christian, very religious. What is it about Christian and I think one of the great American Democrats of his generation, small d, I think he's probably still a member of, I'm not sure if he's a member actually of the Republican Party anymore, but he's certainly not a Democrat, big D. What is it about religious nationalism that has made them against democracy itself? Is it because they're intolerant of other people's views? Are they against the idea of voting? Are they against the idea perhaps of female involvement in politics?
At the end of the day, it's really about consolidating authoritarian forms of political power. It's not just about the culture war or a dispute over theology. It's really, we're engaged in a political war over the future of American democracy. And perhaps it's easier to see when we look abroad. If we look at leaders like Vladimir Putin in Russia and what he does, or Erdogan in Turkey, or leaders in Iran, right? Or Orban in Hungary, when these leaders bind themselves very tightly to ultra-conservative religious figures in their own countries to consolidate a more authoritarian form of political power, we rightly recognize that as religious nationalism. It's really the exploitation of religion, in many instances, the reinterpretation of religion in order to justify authoritarian power. And here's what the religion piece does to these authoritarian leaders. It bubble wraps them in sanctimony. It makes them harder to criticize because they're saying, look, I'm surrounded by these holy men. You can't criticize me. Look how holy and good I am. And they do this in order to interfere with any democratic check on their power and on their corruption. And here's the thing about religious authoritarian leaders and autocratic leaders. Religious nationalists are not the leaders of, say, Christian democracies. They are the leaders of authoritarian states where, often very nepotistic and almost always deeply corrupt. So if you look at a leader like the former President Trump, and you see all of the sort of various forms of corruption he was involved with, you wanted to start to understand why he felt the need to sort of surround himself with these sanctimonious figures in order to give himself a kind of aura of untouchability.
So are you suggesting that their sanctimony, their belief is invented? They're simply political opportunists who has, as you say, wrap themselves up in the bubble of sanctimony and then do their dirty political business?
Well, so let's start with the fact that this is a leadership-driven movement, and it's leadership-driven and it's also organization-driven. And so it involves a very large leadership cadre. And look, like any large group of peoples, it's fairly diverse, and we can't really know what's in everybody's hearts. But both of those things can be true at the same time. These, some of the folks, I think, frankly, are true believers. They really do believe that they're doing what's best for America. Others are making more of a kind of a cynical deal. But you can believe you can be a true believer, but also believe that what's in your economic interests, your political interests, your career interests is also in God's, what God wants. So it's, again, some people say, are they cynical opportunists or are they, true believers? And I think sometimes that you can be an opportunist and also be a true believer.
Katherine, I don't want to turn this conversation into a witch hunt, but are there names of particular leaders who you think are guilty of the excesses you're describing? And are there groups, particular churches that are, in your mind, problematic in terms of the future of American democracy?
That's a great question. And I want to start with the organizations, because there are key organizations that have played a really outsized role in building this movement. And before we get into the specific organizations, we have to talk about the different kinds of organizations. They fall into categories. So for instance, there are right-wing policy groups like the Family Research Council, the American Family Association, Heritage, things like that. Then you have a legal advocacy sphere where you have groups like the Federalist Society, which has played an outsized role in grooming and promoting candidates for judicial appointments. That is, like, for instance, all 6 conservative members of the Supreme Court now have either, current or former ties to the Federalist Society. Then you have, within that legal sphere, you also have groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom, which has in last fiscal year 2021, I believe it is, their budget was $102 million. I mean, this is a very well-funded movement. And working alongside the Alliance Defending Freedom organizations like Liberty Council, Beckett to some degree, First Liberty, and other legal advocacy organizations, Pacific Justice Institute. There are networking organizations. The Council for National Policy is an extraordinarily powerful organization. It serves to get the leadership of the movement of the different pieces of infrastructure on the same page, and it brings them together with people who can fund their initiatives. So the Council for National Policy is very important, and other networking organizations, including like the Congressional Prayer Caucus and things like that. You have data initiatives that do a tremendous amount of work identifying voters that might be favorable, could be turned into, lending support for the movement. The movement operates through a lot of religious infrastructure. So there are these pastoral organizations that leaders of the movement know very well. If you can get the pastors, you can get their congregations to vote, right? So they draw these pastors into networks like Watchmen on the Wall or Church United or Faith Wins, all of these organizations that I've written about, or they even have like Latino-focused pastors networks like Ministros Hispanos. And what they'll do is they'll bring these pastors together, do presentations for them. In many instances, like Watchmen on the Wall has tens of thousands of affiliated pastors. I mean, these are very large-scale organizations. And they give these pastors talking points, voter guides, tools, sermon starters, things to try to get them to activate their congregants to vote their so-called biblical values.
Are there particular funders who are driving this? The Koch brothers, of course, they're no longer around, or certainly one of them isn't around anymore. They used to fund a lot of the more conservative initiatives. Peter Thiel, the multi-billionaire tech guy, is driving a lot of these investments now, certainly of Trump-supported people. Is there a particular money source here?
The movement has three sources of funding. The first is, as you said, large, very big ticket donors like the Betsy DeVos and Prince family juggernaut, the Green family, the Wilkes brothers, and Sean Filer, so many others that I have written about in Power Worshippers and elsewhere. And many of these funders are as committed, if not more committed, to far-right economic policy as they are to right-wing positions in the so-called culture wars. So what they're really after is tax breaks for the rich, minimal regulation of business, minimal rights for the workforce, and things like that, all the kind of policies that are going to enlarge plutocratic wealth. And in some instances for them, like the culture wars are like just the shiny baubles that they get the rank and file to vote for. Oh, if you can get them to vote on identity issues, and oh, my marriage might be in threat because of my gay neighbors, well, then you can get them to vote for the hyper-conservative candidates that are going to do what these big funders want. So that's the first source of funding. Second source is small dollar donations from the rank and file. And there's a lot of activity to get those smaller dollar donations. Third source of funding is taxpayer money. And we see this is a movement that really wants the taxpayer, you and me, my dollars and yours, to fund their churches and their initiatives and their religious schools. And we see this most obviously in their effort to claim a piece of the pie that is going to public education. They know if they can capture a piece of that, they can fund their religious schools without end, and then train a new generation of children to be good and faithful soldiers in their movement.
Katherine, what about the racial and the geographic nature of this movement? In our conversation with Dana Milbank, he very much associated this new Republican Party with whiteness and believes that ultimately, as America becomes more diverse by the middle of the 21st century, this white Christian party will be voted out of office by an increasingly diverse America. Is religious nationalism, the religious right that you've studied with such care, is it almost exclusively white and male and based in the South?
No. This is I think the racial dynamics at work here are complex. And I want to take a bit of time to unpack that. So yes, racial privilege is built into the movement. It was present at the movement's founding. Much of the movement got its start in reaction to equality, the civil rights movement, certainly in its current iteration. The idea that racially segregated schools might have their special tax privileges revoked, that was something that sort of really upset leaders of the movement in an earlier era. But movement leaders, the smart movement leaders, people like Ralph Reed, who is the head of the Faith and Freedom Coalition, who's very seasoned and astute, he can see the demographic future as clearly as you and I can. And in recent years, he and other movement leaders have made substantial efforts to broaden the racial component of the movement. They've reached out to conservative-leaning pastors of color and community leaders in order to draw them into the movement. And they've had an extraordinary success, certainly with many conservative-leaning Latino pastors. Let's not forget that between 2016 and 2020, the Latino support for Trump overall increased by 8 to 10 points. And that's pretty substantial numbers. And much of this has to do also with the spread of, there's a lot of shift in, like among Latinos overall in America. The sort of Latinos, of course, are as complex and diverse as any other group in America. But the idea that, the Catholicism is on the wane, and Pentecostal and charismatic faith, which is statistically much more conservative. It too is diverse, but statistically much more conservative, is on the rise. And there's been, substantial spread of primarily Latino churches that are Pentecostal and charismatic, and many of those are being drawn into pastor networks as well. So yes, there's a real irony here that these pastors are driving support for a movement whose political candidates are trying to suppress votes and that affect people in districts that are disproportionately people of color. The movement is promoting this sort of idea that is so sort of racialized religious identity. You're an insider or you're an outsider. You're pure versus the impure. You're one of us or you're one of them. And it's these lines are being patrolled with as much fury as ever. And yet, there's white nationalism and there's Christian nationalism. If you look at, there's a substantial amount of overlap, but there's also some distinctions as well. I think for many of the white people involved in the movement, it is white. It is culturally white. When they talk about how America was founded as a Christian nation, they're hearkening back to this idea that America was all white. But the movement leaders are sensitive to accusations of racism, and so they have sought to certainly promote the appearance of diversity, and it is also having some substantial consequences at the ballot box.
Katherine, last year we had Margaret Atwood on the show, of course, one of our greatest writers, the author of The Handmaid's Tale, a dystopian future built around fecundity and the cult of female fecundity. You mentioned Catholicism as well and how it's in decline, but Catholics seem to dominate the Supreme Court. They've been very influential in Roe versus Wade. To what extent are the religious nationalists that you write about, that you've researched in the power worshippers, how much are they in bed, so to speak, with Roman Catholics, and particularly on the issue of abortion and the cult of female fecundity?
The movement would be nowhere. Look, the movement includes representatives of a variety of both Protestant and non-Protestant religion. It would be nowhere without the involvement of a cadre of ultra-conservative Catholics. And the movement even derives support from some people who do not identify as Christian at all. What unites them more than any particular theology is a common political vision. Many people describe this movement as evangelical, and it really isn't. I mean, I think people don't understand that the fact that Pentecostals and charismatics are now comprising a very substantial and important part of the movement. If you look at the Federalist Society and look at somebody like Leonard Leo, who is a very devout, ultra-conservative Catholic, who determined years ago that the American public would never submit to the supposed moral medicine that was necessary to restore our country. And he recognized that if you take over the courts, you can take over the country. And so he was one of the folks who played an outsized role in shaping our courts by, building up the Federalist Society into the powerhouse that it is today, finding and promoting legal talent. And by the way, Leonard Leo was just given control over a new fund, $1.6 billion that a donor gave to support right-wing and conservative, supposedly conservative politics. So again, this is, he's and he did so as part of an extension of an organization called the Napa Institute, which is also dominated by ultra-conservative Catholics. Timothy Bush is its founder. And we see that there's a real battle within Catholicism. Look, many American Christians, including many American Catholics, large numbers of Catholics, really anchor their commitment in social justice to their faith. But there are battles within religion, Protestantism, Catholicism, every other religion, tensions where there's groups that are trying to sort of push more conservative agendas and others that are promoting a more liberal agenda. And the conservatives really are the ones who are most determined to have an influence in our politics.
Katherine, in Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, this dystopian vision, a warning, I guess, about the future, which she wrote from Canada, she suggests perhaps about America of the future. Women don't have a great deal of power. They're viewed purely as vessels, if that's the right word, to have children. Is this the political goal of the religious right that you have studied in such detail? Do they want to create a world like Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, where women don't have political power?
It's really interesting because there are a lot of very empowered women within the Christian nationalist movement, but many of them have to pass through this Rubicon of anti-abortion politics in order to prove their, bona fides. They have to prove that they have this sort of correct ideological viewpoint. I think they're really, the movement makes use of them because they seem, they can pretend this is in women's interests. And I think that we can look to people like Penny Young Nance or Jean Mancini or Christiane Hawkins, who are these incredibly empowered, they call themselves pro-life leaders. But what they're really trying to do is strip reproductive autonomy in economic autonomy. I mean, without the right to control your fertility, you do not have the right. And they're, by the way, going after certain, like they're just getting started with the overturning of Roe versus Wade. You don't have to take my word for it, take their word for it. I was at the last National Pro-Life Summit. It's an annual gathering in Washington, D.C., where you hear from many of the biggest leaders in the movement. And Christiane Hawkins, who's the president of Students for Life of America, one of the major powerhouse anti-abortion organizations, she said, let me tell you what we want to do. I'm sort of paraphrasing here. She said, we want to introduce a constitutional amendment that will ban abortion in all 50 states, but that's going to take some time set up. And, I spoke to a representative of the Alliance Defending Freedom, that legal powerhouse of the religious right, and he said pretty much the same thing. And, I feel like we don't often listen very well. We need to listen to these people and take them at their word. They're also describing pregnancy as beginning at the moment of fertilization. Now, the way all the professional physicians organizations describe pregnancy is beginning from the moment of conception or implantation or successful implantation, right? Nobody knows when an egg is fertilized. There's no way to measure that. But so by calling that the moment of the beginning of pregnancy, it's a completely religious, specious definition. But by doing that, if they call pregnancy the moment of fertilization, that would end up banning various forms of birth control. They're already going after morning after pills, emergency contraception. So by stripping people's reproductive autonomy from them, they're prohibiting women from having control over their relationships, control over their lives in most basic ways. It's already impacting maternal health care, women who are engaged, having pregnancy loss, women who are whose fetuses have gross fetal abnormalities incompatible with life and are now being compelled to carry them to term, putting those women's lives at risk. Prohibiting doctors from treating women who are undergoing miscarriages. I mean, it's really grotesque what's happening across the country. And these kinds of policies are very unpopular. But again, it goes back to what Leonard Leo recognized. If policy can be unpopular, but we can force it on them if we can capture the courts.
Well, what about how to fix all this, Katherine? They want to ban abortion. Should we want to ban them?
Well, you can't, ban fellow citizens. I, hold out the hope that by investing, if enough people, listen, we are the majority. Those of us who reject the politics of conquest and division are the majority in this country. We really need to act like it, right? But the reason they're able to dominate, even though this is a minority of the country, is they vote in disproportionate numbers. And they also are very susceptible. They've been made susceptible to propaganda. So when you've got a country where, I just read a statistic this morning, some 25% of 18-year-olds are registered to vote. If we get larger numbers of people to vote, if people would hold others in their circles accountable to vote, if people would invest in democratic political infrastructure and become active in local politics in the same way that those who sort of support this movement have become active in their local politics as well, we could really turn the ship around. It will take some time because we're dealing with the consequences of the movement's focus on the courts. But listen, our country has faced terrible crises in the past, and many individuals have certainly experienced worse situations than you or I have, and yet they've still persisted in fighting. So I do think it's an all hands on deck moment. Everybody has to do their part.
So if the fix is political, Katherine, we all need to vote and organize and act as with the kind of political expediency that they do. What about splitting off some of the movement? Because clearly there are good people, as you suggested, amongst them. They care about the world. They care about life, maybe in a rather odd kind of way that you and I don't agree on. But are there parts of this movement that can be, if you like, hijacked by democracy?
I think we're seeing fissures. I think that there's a faction of the movement that will stand behind Trump. He's their leader. They treat him like a god. They call him King Cyrus. They, hold up paintings with Trump and eagles and crosses and everything like that. And then there are many others who really dislike him. And they prefer, frankly, somebody like DeSantis, who will continue with the politics of Trumpism, but maybe with a bit less chaos and a bit less overt corruption. Same authoritarian politics, less overt corruption. So, there are fissures in different ways. I think that there are a large numbers of Republicans these days who are true conservatives, who truly believe in conserving what's best about our country and believe in incremental change, not radical change, and who are very dismayed and feel like they do not have a political party. Look, I'm not a political strategist, but I see fissures in a lot of areas. There's also a lot, frankly, of women who are themselves culturally Republican and, perhaps fiscal conservatives, but they really don't want anyone telling them, when they need to have baby. They really understand that control over one's body, the right to access appropriate medical care if one is in distressed pregnancy is really essential to free lives. So I think that there are various ways in which we're starting to see some fissures. And, again, I'm not a political strategist, but the smart political strategists might be able to sort of find those and exploit them.
Given that these people seem to want to do away with the church-state division of modernity, what's the role of the law here and the legal community in particular, Katherine?
I think that those of us who understand that the separation of church and state is not only baked into our First Amendment of our Constitution. It's the first clause of the First Amendment of our Constitution, best piece of real estate in our whole Constitution. It is a principle that has ensured that our inevitably, irreducibly pluralistic society has remained relatively peaceful, even as we've seen so many other countries torn apart by sectarian division. So those of us who recognize the value of the Establishment Clause need to do what the religious right did, I would say 30 years ago, start to strategize and find ways to kind of give it some teeth again, because the religious right has, over these past 3 decades, put into place very carefully and very strategically these novel legal building blocks, cultivating the right cases, bringing them to the right course that have the right judges to sort of create these novel legal theories that, and then they get their big wins. Well, we've already created these new legal structures, like saying, religion isn't really religion, it's just speech from a certain point of view, and then going in for the big win in order to basically destroy the Establishment Clause. And we're seeing that in a number of cases. For instance, in this last Supreme Court period, we had the overturning of Dobbs, but we also had 2 cases related to public education and Supreme Court decisions. Carson versus Macon, which expands the conditions under which states must fund religious schools directly, and Bremerton, which means that public school officials may proselytize children. I mean, this is unbelievable. We don't send our children to public schools to be proselytized by their teachers and coaches. We send them there to get an education, and many of us value public schools because they teach our kids how to get along with others, including those who are different. Like, if our public schools are to function effectively in a society as diverse as ours, we need to set aside our religious agendas and our political agendas and come together in support of our children and their future. But the current Supreme Court is determined to erase that principle from public life, and many of the most honest, frankly, Christian nationalist leaders are very outspoken and saying, the Establishment Clause, I don't believe in the separation of church and state, it's a myth. So
finally, Katherine, are you suggesting that for people who believe in democracy, the line in the sand is education, and the attempt by the religious right to transform public education into church education, and that's where the real battles are going to take place, and that's where we believers in democracy need to fight, not literally, of course, but in a metaphorical political sense?
I think the real battle is down. The bright line is our rights. They're going after our rights. They're going after our right to send our children to public school free from proselytizing. They're going after our right to bodily autonomy. They're going to go after the right of people to marry and love who they choose. They're going to go after the right to vote, the right to free speech. I mean, it just doesn't end there. So I think that, again, we are in a real battle for the soul of democracy, and it is an all hands on deck moment, and everybody can play a part. There's a role to play for everyone.
Well, thank you so much, Katherine. You have convinced me of the seriousness of the situation, and I hope many of our listeners will listen very carefully to what you're saying, act accordingly, certainly read your new book, The Power Worshippers. Thank you so much for appearing on How to Fix Democracy.
Thank you.